Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you who know me will probably suspect that if I'm going to talk about arts, it has to start with tango. This is the most difficult thing I have ever learned in my life, and I continue to learn. And this is my teacher actually performing in Buenos Aires in 2011. So the difficulty I have explaining to my students and also my colleagues is why do we need art in engineering? Okay, never mind mathematics, and the science. I kind of have a gut feeling for it, but I wanted to come up with solid proof. So I wanted to start with engineering. What is engineering? And there's a lot of definitions out there, but the one that really caught my eye is by Lee Nicolai, who was the head of the Lockheed Advanced Development Company. He said, engineering is simply the design of a commodity for the benefit of mankind. So it doesn't matter what we build as engineers, it has to do with improving the quality of our life. And then a few weeks ago, actually, on the New York Times, I ran into this beautiful story, and I'm thinking, gee, I'm a mechanical engineer, I want to design a wheelchair, and I'm looking at my mom now in Portugal sitting in a wheelchair, which is pathetic, it's not comfortable, whatever. And these people, they want the wheelchair to dance in. Okay, so this raises the requirements, at a much, higher level. So engineering, the design of a commodity for the benefit of mankind. So what is design? That's the next thing in my thinking process. And most of us think that design is a bunch of equations. We have to solve the equations, and we got it made. But before we solve any equations, we have to come up with an idea. I'm trying to solve a problem. I'm trying to create a new product. And ideas, they start typically on the right side of the brain, which is creative, which is associative. The right side of the brain, as we know, it has no rules. It's kind of like an anarchic part of the body. Uncritical thinking, it has to be rational, illogical, anything goes. And typically it diverges, rather than converging into a single, place. So once the right brain develops those ideas, where do they go? They go on the left side of the brain where they're being analyzed. And in order to do that, we need rigid rules. We need critical thinking. We have to be rational, logical. Will this work? Okay, I don't know. Let's apply Bernoulli's equation. Let's apply the momentum equation, calculate the forces. And a good designer basically is one who can flip-flop from one side of the brain to the other at will, and you got to do this over and over and over in an iterative fashion until finally you make up your mind, this is what I'm going to go with, and you go ahead and you build it. So design then is a very creative process. And why arts? How do we bring arts into design? Well, first of all, the first simple reason why we need arts I came up with is to communicate our designs. And the classic example of that is Da Vinci's drawings. They were made hundreds of years ago, but we know exactly what he intended to do with all of these devices. And he had hundreds of these drawings. So in the early days of engineering, we used to ask our students to sketch. And this is how they communicated early design ideas. Now we jump straight into CAD, and that's very time-consuming and premature. But beyond communication, we also need to sell the idea. So we need to be able to help others visualize what this thing is going to look like. This example is from one of my students, actually, in aircraft design years ago. He designed a very large luxury airship that was supposed to cruise slowly over downtown San Francisco or New York at night, and people are enjoying their cocktails while enjoying the view as well outside. And he came up with this thing here. I go, wow, now I know exactly what he means, what he wants to make. The arts also help us be creative. So we know that in engineering we need to be creative in our solutions. So by engaging the arts, we can actually help develop our creativity. And something that I had not thought about until I read a book by Daniel Pink is we have an obligation, there's an expectation out there to make engineering products beautiful, not just functional. So is beauty a new requirement? Hardly. if you look at the Parthenon, they took great pain to make, you know, the harmony come through the eyes, and in fact, in order to make the columns look parallel, you know, we know the tricks that they played because they understood, you know, geometry. So Daniel Pink, in his book A Whole New Mind, he claims basically that in the 21st century, the right brainers are going to rule the world, not the so-called smart people of the 20th century, who are the people who can do math and science. And he says it's no longer enough to create a product that's reasonably priced and functional. It must also be beautiful. It must be unique and meaningful. So as an engineer, he says, I need to figure out how things work, okay? And I'm going to talk tomorrow about the 737 MAX and how to do things, you know, not to work. But if these things are not also pleasing to the eye or compelling to the soul, few will buy them. Because these days we have choices. When you go buy a car, you've got 100 different models. When you go buy a laptop, you know, you got 50. So as far as I'm concerned, the first thing I do is the looks, okay? If it looks beautiful, I will consider, you know, everything else in my evaluation. So another quote by Steve Jobs. He said, it's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing. And nowhere is that more true than in these post-PC devices. So that was from his talk when he introduced the iPad 2. So am I an Apple person? Yes. So the idea here is to make connections across the disciplines. And our educational system, unfortunately, tends to produce specialists. And that's necessary, you know, if I want to improve the aerodynamics of the wing, you know, to make it produce, you know, more lift and less drag, you know, that's how you go. But on the other hand, I need to put together a whole airplane. So I need to have the big picture, and I need to know how to integrate subsystems. So I need to know a little bit of everything. And making connections across the disciplines is hardly, you know, new. One of the examples I found years ago, I read a book about Brunelleschi's dome. I highly recommend it. And it talks about the challenges that he had to face in order to make this beautiful dome on the Florence, you know, cathedral. It was not an easy engineering task to make that thing stand there. And of course, there are a lot of tricks that you could have played engineering-wise to make sure it doesn't collapse, but he wanted it to look beautiful. That was the whole, you know, challenge. So in 1430, it was the largest cathedral in the world, and it was the most beautiful cathedral in Italy. In fact, it may still be, you know, the most beautiful cathedral in Italy. So at the time, the Italians produced a lot of beautiful things, and all of them, they actually had to combine engineering and the arts, you know, to make it look the way they were. But the classic example of making connections across the disciplines was Leonardo da Vinci. We all know it was the ultimate example of how ability to make connections, arts, science, humanities, and technology was key to his innovation, imagination, and genius. By the way, I found out years ago, although we give credit to Sir George Cayley for being the inventor of the airplane because he made a little sketch, you know, of an airplane. Leonardo in the 1500s, he had a much more detailed design of an airplane, and unfortunately his drawings had been misplaced, and someone else, you know, got the credit. So if arts were always integrated with engineering, how on earth did we lose our way? It turns out that after World War II, engineering schools began to emphasize analysis and science at the expense of hands-on design skills. And so in the 90s, I started reading a bunch of articles, people screamed, like Nikolai, that I mentioned earlier, screaming that you guys are producing top-notch scientists, but they don't know how to design engineering projects. And in a company like Lockheed or Intel or, you know, whatever engineering company, we don't make science. We take science and we use it to create something new. And these kids, you know, obviously they didn't know how to do that because we don't teach them. So in the 90s, the engineering curricula started playing around with introducing design at the freshman level, you know, and having, you know, students practice, you know, more with design. We came to the point where automatically scientists and engineers were classified as convergers, left-brainers, and artists as divergers. So if someone was creative, we would push them, that you would make a good artist, as if we don't need creativity in engineering. And still, to this point, actually, science and engineering curricula, they tend to overemphasize analytical, deductive skills. And as a result of that, even if students bring to us a little bit of creativity, down the road that tends to atrophy because we don't put it to work right away, and then we remember it in the senior design, in the last year. So that's something we need to work on. So some ideas, moving forward. I'm not going to claim that we have a systemic way of integrating A into STEM in my university or any other university for that matter. So I'm fumbling my way moving forward with my small department in aerospace engineering. But I think that one of the key ideas is that students need to understand the role of arts in STEM. They're not going to take it for granted. I get a couple of students every once in a while complaining and says, gee, I could be taking another 30 units of engineering courses. Why do I have to take, humanities and music appreciation and this and that? I have to sit down with them, and have a talk and explain it to them. Because they don't understand the connection. So the solution is basically art-infused STEM in teaching and learning. And the same way we do it, with writing. For example, one course in writing is not going to teach students, how to write. You have to integrate it, throughout the curriculum. The same thing with math. We have to apply math, pretty much in every course. So one of the things that I did years ago, and unfortunately my colleague, retired and I haven't picked up on it, but I had students, graduate students from the College of Arts, a particular course, actually 276, who came into my aircraft design class and taught my students how to sketch, how to do freehand drawing, contour drawing, gesture drawing, and perspective. And it was amazing to see the breadth of abilities, in my class. And you basically have an ability to sketch something from where you left off when you were in kindergarten. If you have not sketched anything in between, you're going to be doing stick diagrams, basically. Another classic example, and I remember that because I read an article a couple of days ago. Pythagoras was characterizing his fellow mathematicians as poets. He was saying we're all poets. So I just remembered years ago I read an article on the Journal of Engineering Education about incorporating poetry into engineering. So I asked my students, I created an assignment and I said, take a concept, any concept from the class. Conservation of mass, pump, jet engine, airplane, whatever, and write a poem about it. You can use your creativity, it doesn't have to rhyme. All I'm looking for though is whatever you say, it has to be technically correct. So just because a poem, I don't want any, nonsense, scientifically speaking. So I got a lot of poems in my collection. I chose one that it kind of, got my eye, the turbulent history of fluid mechanics. So I want to leave you with a couple of verses. I'm going to read the first one and the last one. It all started with Archimedes way back in BC, who was faced with an interesting problem, you see. The king came to me and this story he told. I'm not sure if my crown is pure gold. Of course, Archimedes caused quite a sensation, but not because of his great revelation. As he was running through the streets of Syracuse, he didn't notice he was wearing only his shoes. So with that, I'll close my presentation and then we can go into questions. Thank you.